Hi everyone, my name is Charlie, and today I have my October wrap-up. The first book that I read in October was The Upstairs Room by Kate Marie Brown. I read this book because, well, I purchased this book originally because Joanna Cannon recommended it, and since she wrote now two of my favourite books, I thought I'd give it a go. And I was expecting a modern day tale with a very gothic twist. I saw that this was a story of possible ghosts and these people moving into a new home that's a Victorian home, and how there's a possible almost curse lingering in the house, and they have this lodger who is also going to be experiencing some things. And that's not really what I got. I got the mild sense of it being a very British psychological thriller, in that it was all in the home, but I never really got a ghost story. I never really got gothic. I never really got scared. Not that I went into this book expecting to be scared, but I expected to, you know, be kind of chilled, a bit thawed, you know, taken out the freezer but cooked a bit too soon, that sort of thing. But, oh my lord, I didn't get that. If this book had been billed as a book about relationships, then it would have been doing itself a favour. I wouldn't have read it, but it would have been doing itself a favour, because that's all this book is about. This book is about telling you all about this couple's relationship, and I do mean telling you that I am a big advocate of breaking the rules of writing once you know the rules. And had the telling and exposition within this book been done well and being done in such a way that I thought it was great, then, you know, this would be getting a great review right now. But it didn't. It just felt like every single soap opera I've ever seen melded together and put into this book. I felt like the writer was too fearful to go there, to really say if this was ghosts or not. And because she was so worried about it being ghosts and people thinking, oh wait, this makes me a horror writer, this puts me into a box, I felt like the writer then included these other very tenuous ideas as to what it could actually be, and because of that my enjoyment was really just thrown. And sometimes there were certain words in here, now again, not a prude, no, you can have an expletive in fiction every now and then, but I was taught when I was at uni, again, another rule, that you should only include a expletive if it actually fits, and to me it didn't fit with this story. And there were certain words that I was just like, oh, it felt very much like you've said that to impress me, but I wasn't impressed. The characters, to me, Eleanor, Richard and Zoe, were dull. I had to look up their names before I even did this review because I'd forgotten their names. You could have just said it was ghosts. Dickens had ghosts in his books. Other people have had ghosts in their books and then gone on to write very normal general fiction without the spectral element in there. And to me, it just got too worried to be what it wanted to be. Next, I read The Mudfog Papers by Charles Dickens. In a similar fashion to the Pickwick Papers, this is a rather short collection of stories that parody and, is it pastiche, the scientific writing of the time. At least that's what I found out when I was reading about this book. There are only two stories in here that I liked, that had me laughing and had me feeling the way that I usually feel about Charles Dickens, which is just that there's some sort of majesty and magic within his prose, that he can be writing about the dullest thing and to me it will feel like Hogwarts. That's the only way that I can explain it. And I got that with two stories here. The others I felt were a bit bland. I felt like they were a bit like the Christmas tree story that I read last year in that was included in my edition of A Christmas Carol, in that it just felt like Charles Dickens was just doing this list of stuff. I would only recommend this if you have read all of Dickens' other works, which I haven't, but if you've read some Dickens before and you're interested in reading a short Dickens, because this is only about 100 and something pages, by all means get it. It's a collection of short stories. You could read one here and there, but otherwise it's not his best work, so you could just leave it, not even know it existed, like I didn't until last month. Since I can't find this book, I'm just going to have to talk about it, and that is Cramming Third by Elizabeth Gaskell. I've wanted to read Elizabeth Gaskell for a long time now. Originally I was going to start with North and South, but then I found out that Cramming Third was supposedly based on Knutsford. I live rather close to Knutsford, and I've done a few readings there, and Knutsford Library has a very big Elizabeth Gaskell collection. I mean, obviously it's not her house where you can go, but it has a nice little collection that you can go and look at. And so I was in the shop where I work, and I saw a copy of Cramming Third, and it had the cover from the TV show that was out years ago, and I thought, well, I thought that this would be something nice to read in my car in the half an hour before work each day, because that's what I started doing. Rather than listen to an audiobook, I'm reading in my car. And Cramming Third was brilliant. It was my first introduction to Elizabeth Gaskell, and I found it hilarious. I write about older characters, and when I read this book, I was like, Charlie, you're doing nothing new in what you're doing, because it's all been done before, which I kind of knew, but you like to think you're being groundbreaking when you're a young man. I thought Cramming Third was bloody brilliant. It was kind of like a collection of vignettes that went on for about 200 pages, and I didn't know what the main character's name was, so then I happened to watch Katie from Books and Things video about it. I was like, ah, this makes sense now. It explained it a bit to me, and I was like, okay, this is making all sense. Like, I'd been laughing before, but I was kind of like, no idea who I'm actually laughing at here. And there's some very funny moments, some very poignant moments. I like that it talks mostly about women. The majority of characters in here are all women, and that was great. I had a very fun time, and I did find myself laughing. So Cramming Third, I do recommend it, and I will be going on to read some of Elizabeth Gaskell's other works when I eventually find them at the library. I have discovered a new favourite book, and that is Lillian Boxfish Takes a Walk by Kathleen Rooney. I began reading this book for the summer cosy reading night run by Lauren over at Lauren and the Books, and I didn't really get far in. And then over a period of 2 months I read this book. I'd go back and read a bit here and read a bit there, and then Lauren announced that the second cosy reading night was happening, and I was like, well, I need to get this book read then. And I think I only had about 50 pages left, and I really enjoyed taking my time with this book. I know that's a thing people say, and it seems like a cop-out sometimes. It seems like, no, what you're telling me is that the book didn't keep you hooked. But this book, it did keep me hooked, but in a completely different way, in that if I started it, I'd read it, and when I eventually put it down, I'd just kind of not forget about it, but kind of process it. And I had a lot of thoughts when I was reading this book, in that some ways it could be linked to Mrs. Dalloway when Clarissa goes out to buy flowers. In other ways I was being reminded of A Christmas Carol, with Lillian Boxfish being her own ghost as she explores her past, present, and thinks about her future, and thinks about somehow changing. And she does, I think, even though she is a much older character in this book, which takes place, I should have said this, it takes place at New Year's Eve Day 1985, and she's exploring New York, and New York becomes its own figure. It's, again, Dickens if I was linking it back to Dickensian, it was very much like London, how London is explored and talked about, and the city is so much a part and a character of this novel, and it really, it characterises Lillian. At the end of it, I found out that Lillian Boxfish was based on a real human character on the character of Margaret Fishback, which I didn't know going into this. I think it was based on her, but all of the events in it are fictionalised. And I just thoroughly adored this book. Again, it reminded me of The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, which was my favourite book from the cosy reading night that I was reading. This was a woman on her own pilgrimage, and I think to me it would actually surpass the Harold Fry book. I enjoy reading about older characters, and maybe I was creating all of these links myself. Maybe it was just how I was reading it and bringing all my knowledge from other books that I've read and using them to colour my view of this book. But that doesn't mean that I didn't find this book absolutely enthralling. I really enjoyed seeing Lillian go and speak to characters on this night as she walks, because I don't know that it changes her, but it gives you an idea of the woman that she has become now that most of the people around her have left her. I just really thought it was brilliant, and that a lot of people should go out and buy it. And yeah, it had an older female character not taking any shit, doing a job properly, being a somewhat feminist icon, and it was just marvellous. And it is a book that I will be revisiting in the future, and I am very grateful that I watched Russell from Ink and Paper Blog's video months ago when he was talking about this book, because I found a new favourite. Next, I read Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. Me and this book had a complicated relationship, but at the start of this year I said that I was going to finally finish reading Our Mutual Friend. I'm going to take you back now, 2 years ago, when I first started this channel and when I was going to Rome. Now, I had never gone on a plane before. Because I went for a voucher, you had to go from Gatwick to get to Rome. And so, me and my mother were driving from Macclesfield to Gatwick, which is about a 6 to 7 hour drive. I'd decided that on the way, I was going to listen to the majority of Our Mutual Friend on audiobook, and then I was going to listen to it at the airport, and then I'd be done by the time I got to Rome, which is when I was going to start another book. However, I was listening to this book at triple speed. I'd been listening to it before then, but I was going to finish it this night. And I kept missing things. And I think it was because I was listening to it too quickly to try and rush through it. And I kept finding that Charles Dickens was changing tense. And because he was changing tense, that was annoying me. And so when I eventually got to Rome and hated it, so not hated the book, but really disliked where I was in Rome. I wasn't in the actual part of Rome that I was supposed to be in. We were half an hour away from Rome, which you had to get a bus ride in every time you wanted to go in, and we couldn't be doing with it. So my feeling disenchanted meant that I didn't want to read or listen to Our Mutual Friend, so I put it down. Throughout last year, I kept trying to pick it up. I'd got to page 270 when I was reading it, listening to it the first time. Didn't do well with it. Tried again, kept getting stuck at page 50 or page 30, trying different editions and all that fun stuff. And then at Christmas last year, I said that I wanted to read this book this year. And also, it was Victorian October. And so, one of the main people behind Victorian October is Katie from Books and Things. And if you follow her channel, you'll know that this is her favourite book. And I thought, we need to get this book done. We need to get this book finished. We were helping my brother move to Northumberland, which is well, it took us 6 hours to get there, and then it was 5 hours back, I think. And I listened to this. I didn't listen to it at triple speed this time. And I found that as I was listening to it, sometimes I was reading along as well, I had about 5 hours listening left to do on the day we were moving them. And I thoroughly enjoyed this book this time. This is Dickens' last work, and it follows a whole host of characters who are somehow connected. You have the Veneerings, who are newly rich. You have the Boffins and the Lamels and the Wilfers, and you had Silas Wegg, who blooming heck, he annoyed me, and you had Mr. Venus, who I remember from listening to it the first time was the character that I'd become a bit compelled by because he seemed like the weirdest character I'd ever seen in fiction. And the plot centres around a dead man. John Harmon, who returned to England to inherit a fortune, has turned up drowned, supposedly. The story follows all of these different characters really scrabbling for wealth, I think is the only way to describe it. And I think that it's a brilliant portrayal of how money can corrupt, how power can corrupt. There were certain things that happened to Mr. Boffin in this book where I was actually shouting at the audiobook, taking out my headphones and having a go at people. And so I was pretty glad when we had a revelation about Mr. Boffin. And I think for Dickens' last completed novel, it's a work of genius. Next, I went on holiday. So I didn't take any of the physical books with me. I took my Kindle because I have a ton of NetGalley books on there that I still haven't read and really should be getting to because I need to review those. And, you know, like, a lot of the books have actually passed the publication date by quite a long way now. So I got through 2, and I have about 30 to get through, so we know how this is going. Firstly, I read A Pocketful of Crows by Joanne Harris. I wanted something gothic because it was getting towards Halloween, and I hadn't got that with the upstairs room here. This book is a retelling of The Brown Girl, and it follows a character who I'm pretty confident remains nameless, well, a character who remains nameless for reasons relating to fairy tale lore. And then she is this character who can shift into animals and into trees and explore the world by shifting into them. She's got some sort of primal magic. And then she falls in love with a prince, and turns out your fella here is a bit of a dick. After she begins to fall out of love with the prince, there is a brilliant revenge plot. I adored this book. I like Joanne Harris's writing anyway, but I think she really captured the folklore style of voice that was necessary for this book. I did have an issue towards the end of this book in that I don't believe the final chapter was necessary, because I think that we'd got a very good last line with the penultimate chapter. However, I do understand why Joanne Harris wanted to bring it all back on itself and tie all the end. I'd recommend the book if you were looking for something wintry and dark and fairy tale-esque. I listened to How to Be Champion, which is Sarah Millican's autobiography. This book was hilarious, obviously. It was great to listen to because Sarah Millican narrates it herself, which was probably the best because it is her story. And yeah, really quite enjoyed this. Some of the stuff, if you've seen Sarah Millican's shows before, you might have heard a few things, but it really delved back into the archives of Sarah Millican's life and career. And if you're a fan, you're going to enjoy this book. I'm a fan, enjoyed this book. And it's definitely in the realms of furiously happy for just making you feel good. And finally, I read Spellslinger by Sebastian de Castell, the first book in his new young adult fantasy series, which follows a young boy of Callan who is in a magical world with quickly diminishing magic. And in this world, if you don't have magic, you are going to become a slave to the magical caste. It's the way of their world. His uncle, who originally had magic, lost his magic and is thus his father's servant. And it was things like that, this talk about class and caste and stuff, that to me was just, it was really annoying to read about. As in, I was annoyed for the character, and I was annoyed for the characters having to live through this. There was supposed to be some sort of Western setting. It did talk about invading countries and taking things that aren't yours. I think it was very much influenced by the American West and stories of how the West was won, with this magical flair and how everything was related to all these different magics and stuff. It's not an original fantasy by any means, but I read Sebastien de Castel's the Greatcoat series earlier this year and thoroughly enjoyed that. Didn't really like this book as much as I'd enjoyed them, but definitely thought that it was worth a read and will be going out and getting the sequel. I think it's a good book for young adults because it does capture that sense of not being able to live up to your parents' expectations and fighting for something that you can't necessarily get, like aspiring for something and not knowing whether you're going to achieve it. So there's this introduction of a character who has a different kind of magic that really informs Callan and where he's going to go towards the end of this book. There's a bit of a twist that I did see coming, and I saw it coming simply because I knew the title of the second book. If you like fantasy, if you like Sebastien de Castel, then you're probably going to enjoy this book. So go out and get it for the sen. Them's the books. If you have read any of these books and would like to discuss them, please feel free to do so down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.